George Pataki probably needs no introduction to an Albany audience. He was mayor of Peekskill, a member of the State Assembly and Senate, before serving 3 terms as New York State's 53rd governor from 1995 to 2006. Widely hailed as a moderate Republican, you remember we had that extinct species that used to roam the American landscape, but out of New York's 57 governors, only one, Nelson Rockefeller, another moderate Republican, served longer than Governor Pataki. His accomplishments as governor are far too many to list here, but private sector job creation, tax cuts, supporting abortion rights, outlawing discrimination against gays, championing renewable energy, environmental conservation policies, and protecting over 1 million acres of open space in New York. But also, most significantly, he led the state through the catastrophic 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the very difficult task in the aftermath of rebuilding Lower Manhattan and a decimated state economy. Now, a few words about Max Boot, historian, biographer, best-selling author, foreign policy analyst. I think of him as a quadruple threat. He's the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a weekly columnist for the Washington Post. Somehow, squeezed around all that, he managed to write this best-selling 836-page biography, Reagan, His Life and Legend. I've read plenty of political biographies, written a couple myself, and believe me when I tell you that Boot's Reagan biography belongs right up there on the pantheon of great presidential biographies, with ones written by David McCullough, Ron Chernow, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Edmund Morris, Robert Caro. But don't just take my word for it. Reagan, His Life and Legend was named one of the 10 best books of 2024 by the New York Times, selected for Best Books of the Year list from the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and the Economist. Quote, "This elegant biography of the 40th president stands out for its deep authority and nimble style, a landmark work," the New York Times said, and the Washington Post called it magisterial, vivid, splendid. Boot is also the author of 5 previous books with a focus on military history. His biography, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. In addition to his writing, Boot is a former op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal, and you regularly see him as a commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, and other programs. He was born in Moscow and moved to the U.S. at age 6 in 1976 from the Soviet Union, and revered the country that offered his family asylum. He was raised in Los Angeles, now lives with his family in New York City, and among his many honors and recognitions are these. He was named one of the 50 most influential Jewish Americans by the Forward newspaper in 2018, and one of America's great immigrants by the Carnegie Corporation in 2019. Politically, he identifies, or did, as a conservative, but he also defines himself as a, quote, natural contrarian. In 2018, he published a book titled The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, where he called the election of Donald Trump on November 8, 2016, quote, one of the most demoralizing days of my life. The morning after Trump's election, he went online and changed his voter registration after he'd been a Republican since turning 18 just before the 1988 presidential election. So at the age of 47, he became an independent. In the final chapter of his Reagan biography, he expands on the Trump effect on the Republican Party. He writes this: "Many analysts wondered if Trump represented a repudiation of Reagan's legacy or a continuation of it. The truth, as with questions of Reagan's intelligence, was complicated." End of quote. We'll get into those complicated truths in our conversation tonight. I'll leave time for audience Q&A. Jen will bring a wireless mic around that you can ask your question. Please do it succinctly and briefly. We'll get to as many questions as possible. Now I'd invite you to please give a warm Albany welcome for Governor George Pataki and Max Boot. Thank you, Paul. So I guess I'm in the middle here. I'm a little intimidated in this company, I will admit.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I wish my mother was still alive to hear it.
All true, all vetted. So we'll start with an easy question. Max, have you been to Albany before? And Governor,
I have.
he's going to jump my lines. But can we start? I know the governor title is like for life and honorific. But can we go Max, Paul, and George just for this? What? It's George.
Max, Paul, and Governor.
Yes.
No. George.
You like George? I've known you a long time, but
Yes,
what does
Since
it feel?
Before I was governor.
Yes. What do you feel? What does it feel like to be back in Albany for you?
I'll tell you, it's great. I hate to say it, but I always loved Albany. I first came here in 1975 as a staffer, and I just fell in love with the city and just was really lucky to be able to spend so much time in Albany. And in Albany, I just want to again recognize Bill Kennedy, who's such a tremendous asset to this city and to the country, and thank you for what you've done. And I see Jack McEnany out there, the Albany County historian, who was in the assembly when I was governor, and I don't think he ever voted for one of my proposals. But so what? We're all here today, and we're all happy. But I've always loved Albany, and it's a tremendous privilege to come back.
Wonderful. And have you been here, Max?
Oh, the tough questions begin. The interrogation commences. I have to say, I've lived in New York City for 20 years. This is my first time in Albany, but thank you for inviting me.
We hope you'll be back many times, Max. So
After this warm welcome, how could I not?
But I'll start with you. Why did you choose Reagan as a subject? And how did you find such complexity and depth when Edmund Morris, a very great biographer, complained there was no there with Reagan? He created this weird pseudo-hybrid where he created himself as a character, was called Dutch, and he kind of just bailed out and wanted to get his advance, I guess. But it was a very weird book. Why did he give up on Reagan as a subject, and why did you choose him?
Well, I will say that I think Edmund Morris's failure was my opportunity because he was given unparalleled access to Reagan as his official biographer, and as you suggest, he had kind of a nervous breakdown and produced this weird quasi-fictional book where he inserted himself as a character in Reagan's life. And what I like to say is the big advantage that I had over Edmund was I never had to interview Ronald Reagan because Reagan was a notoriously difficult interview subject. And I think this was very difficult for Edmund, who I talked to in the course of writing my book, because every interviewer, and certainly Edmund, wanted Reagan to be introspective, to offer insights into his life, to reflect on what had happened. And this was, like trying to get blood from a stone, because all he would get in reply would be the same stock stories and anecdotes, because Reagan had no interest in sharing who he really was. He was one of the most unself-reflective people around, and so I think it drove Edmund batty. And so but I didn't have that. I did not have that challenge. I never got to interview Reagan because he died long before I started this, so I had to kind of work from the outside in and talk to a lot of people who knew him and try to figure out who he was, because if you actually asked Ronald Reagan who he was or what was going on internally, he couldn't give you a very good answer because he just was not that self-reflective. So you really had to work around it, and that's what I did in the course of a dozen years. And this was the fundamental challenge with Reagan, was that everybody thought they knew him. He seemed very genial and friendly and like the guy next door, but the people who actually knew him best told me we didn't really know him, that he was always very remote, inscrutable. He was actually an introvert and a loner. He was not this genial personality that he appeared to be on TV. And so that's the fundamental challenge of figuring out who Reagan was.
So, George, historians like to rank the presidents, and Reagan usually comes in like 8, 9, or 10. Do you agree with that ranking, and did you ever meet him?
I put Reagan higher than that. I just think he was a great president. I remember when he came onto the scene, the first time I heard him, and Max will be interested in this, I was in college in New Haven, and my roommates and I got involved helping Barry Goldwater. And this guy was coming to the Knights of Columbus in downtown New Haven to give a speech for Goldwater. And we sat there, and it was Ronald Reagan. And one of the most moving, incredible presentations I have ever heard in my life, that before or since. And so I just fell in love with him early, before he was elected anything. And then when he was running in 1976, I just thought that he represented the sense of optimism, the belief in America's future, the belief in people as opposed to government, that to me was very inspirational.
Great. And you did meet him another time.
I met him another time. I got elected, I was running for the Assembly in 1984, and Reagan was flying into West Point, in my district, my home. We were very near West Point, so I got to be there and wait at the bottom of the stairs of Air Force One, and Reagan comes down and just shakes my hand, gives me a big hug. He's got a big smile, and he's telling me these great stories, and you just go, this is an incredibly charming, nice, hilarious guy. And then the congressman from that district comes down the steps, and he has this huge black eye. He had fallen somewhere a day or two before, and Reagan goes, "Look at Congressman Gilman. That's what happens if you cross me in Washington. So Pataki, you better make sure you stay with me." And that was a long time ago, but I still remember it like yesterday, because he was just someone who you immediately fell in love with his personality. You might not agree with his politics, but it was hard to dislike his personality.
Thank you. That's a great story. Max, David McCullough spent 10 years on Truman. He said you actually never finished your biography, you just abandoned it. You spent 11, 12 years on the Reagan biography. When did you know it was time to abandon it? And then, did you like Reagan more or less as a person from when you started to when you finished?
Well, I knew it was time to abandon it when my publisher was demanding that they publish it. But in terms of did I like Reagan more or less as a person, really hard to answer, because I think I understood him a lot more as a person, but did I like him better? I don't know. I mean, remember, I was coming from a vantage point of, I was, in the 1980s when Reagan was president, I was a young Republican. I was inspired, in fact, to become a Republican by Reagan's example. So I would say, I was a fairly devout Reaganite and Reagan believer, and I like to say that I have a great debt of gratitude that I owe to President Trump for convincing me not to become a Republican anymore, because I think that gave me an objectivity and a distance that allowed me to understand Reagan much better and to see his faults as well as his strengths, his shortcomings as well as his successes. And I think it would have been very hard to write this book if I were still a Republican, if I were still, enthralled to Reagan as I had been as a young man. So I think I was less enthralled with him by the end of the process, but I always thought, as George said, I always thought that he was a very congenial guy. And to confirm what was just said, I mean, I think anybody who knew Reagan would say that he was almost impossible to dislike, and so that kind of kept me going through the whole writing process, because even though I could see the problems with a lot of his policies, he was still this very gentlemanly, congenial, warm, friendly guy who always had a quip and made people feel at ease, and that came across even down through the years.
Thank you. And George, I'd like you to assess what I think is a growing issue of age in the presidency. Reagan was almost 78 when he left office. There's some dispute if he had begun to show some signs of early Alzheimer's when he was still in the White House. President Biden at 82 was showing signs of declining mental acuity and physical stamina. Trump was the oldest president sworn in, second term at 78, 5 months and 6 days older than Biden at his inauguration. Should there be an age limit as well as a term limit on presidents?
Probably 30 years ago, I would have said yes.
What year were you born? I didn't check Wikipedia.
But given my age now, I'd have to say no. I don't think there should be an age limit. But in all seriousness, I don't think there should be, because people age differently. And I think you look at the difference between Biden and Trump, like him or hate him, either one of them. Trump is full of energy, obviously aware of what's happening, and I don't think you could have said the same about Biden. So I think it comes down to the individual, not a hard and fast limit, just let the people make the decision as to whether or not they think this person is the right one to lead the country.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's startling that, people thought that Reagan was so old when he was elected president. He was 69 years old, and there was a huge age issue. And now, of course, Trump is 78, so we've kind of moved the goalpost. And I mean, in terms of, was Reagan out of it when he was president? I didn't find any evidence that he had dementia. I mean, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1994, and he certainly had the precursor condition even when he was president, but I didn't see any evidence that he had dementia. But there's no question that he was slowing down, and he was not retaining as much information. He was not as active towards the end of his presidency as he had been at the beginning, and so you can see the normal aging process at work.
And he took a bullet, a serious wound. That's a powerful part in your chapter, and came up with one of his greatest quips. Talk about when he was in the hospital, what he said to his wife.
Yeah, well, this was his finest hour in March of 1981, when he was shot at the very beginning of his presidency and came much closer to dying than most people realized at the time. But even when he was almost bleeding out at the hospital, he was still able to say when Nancy came in aghast and saw him, and he was able to quip to Nancy Reagan, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And then, a few minutes later, when he was going into surgery, he was in the operating room, and he was able to tell the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." So he showed tremendous. He showed a tremendous sense of humor in one of the most dire contingencies anybody could possibly imagine, and it actually worked to his political advantage, because that he got a tremendous popularity boost when he survived a shooting, and I think created a bond with the American public that was never truly broken, because he showed kind of the definition of courage, that grace under fire, grace under pressure.
One more for you, Max. You go into great depth about his early life that really shaped his character. Midwestern roots, small town Illinois, family barely scraping by on his father, Jack Reagan's shoe salesman salary, moving from one rented house to the next. And then the scene that just leaped out at me in the book, his father's flat out dead drunk in the snow in front of his house, and Ronald's a young boy who has to carry him in, drag him into the house, get him out of the snow where he probably would have died. Your book seems like a very poignant portrait of a damaged child who spent his life trying to repair the broken places left by a terrible father. But you also seem sympathetic to Reagan's flaws, giving this backstory. Could you talk about that aspect and kind of the conundrum there?
He could have been a character out of Iron Wheat. But there's no question that he had a very difficult childhood, although he always put a positive gloss on it, in part because of his mother's influence. His mother, Nellie, was a very devout member of the Disciples of Christ, and she always taught little Dutch Reagan, as he was then known, to look on the bright side of life, and so he always did. But that his inveterate optimism was kind of a defense mechanism against the very bleak upbringing that he had. So he always tried to put the best portrait on it. But of course, yes, as you say, his family was very poor. They moved around a lot. he didn't really form close attachments with other kids because they were constantly moving, and he didn't want the other kids to know about his family's terrible secret, his father's drinking. And so this was part of a lifelong pattern. He almost never had close friends. He was always very detached from other people. He also was very weary. He was always averse to personal conflict, which people don't realize, because he could be very confrontational as a politician, firing the air traffic controllers, or Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But in his personal life, he never wanted to get into disputes with his kids or with his aides or anybody else. And a lot of that traces back to this very difficult childhood where he would hear his mother and father arguing through the thin walls of the rented houses when Jack would go off on a multi-day bender and spend the family's rent money on booze and come back, and some very nasty scenes. And so I think all of us are really shaped by our childhood experiences, and Reagan certainly was as well. And the kind of sunny, optimistic, happy-go-lucky personality that he developed was really a reaction to this very dark and despairing childhood that he actually had.
So this is for both of you, and the legend part of your subtitle is important because I didn't know so much of that. I was surprised to learn that Reagan was raised as a Democrat, revered FDR and the New Deal. So how do you think that shaped his policies as president? Do you consider Reagan a moderate, a conservative, center-right Republican, and are those terms even meaningful anymore, George?
And I don't know how meaningful they are, but I mean, he was a conservative. There's no question in my mind that he was a conservative, but he was also a realist and a pragmatist. And he understood that to get things done, you couldn't insist on it always being your way. He worked very well, if not with Tip O'Neill, with the Democrats in the House majority at that time. People like Bill Bradley worked with him well. And I thought, there's a big difference between having an ideology and being an ideologue. Reagan was a conservative. I'm a conservative. But not an ideologue. You have to look at what will work, what's practical, and try to solve a problem as opposed to imposing an ideology on it. And I think both parties today have really lost their way because you have too many ideologues who insist on their non-pragmatic solution. And we lurch from one extreme to the other when generally the solution is somewhere towards the middle.
Thank you. Do you want to take that too, Max?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, the reason why Reagan became so popular with the Republican Party, and for a long time, he was the one president that all Republicans revered, a lot of that had to do with his success in retailing conservative ideology. And he was on the campaign trail. He did a better job of selling conservatism than anybody else, certainly a better job than Barry Goldwater did. And often, as I show in the book, during his trajectory going from this liberal New Deal Democrat in the 1930s to this very conservative right-wing Barry Goldwater Republican in the 1960s, he went pretty far to the right. I mean, remember, he was calling Medicare and Medicaid socialized medicine and saying this was the doorway to the end of liberty in America, and he was accusing Democrats of turning America communist. So he often on the campaign trail or on the speaking circuit in the early 60s, he often sounded like this John Birch Society kook. But when he actually became governor of California, he moved to the center, and just in the way that George just said, that he showed that he could divorce his campaign rhetoric from his governing style. And he understood, as governor of California, he had to do deals with Jesse Unruh, who was the very powerful Democratic Speaker of the California Assembly, and he did. And he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, one of the toughest gun control bills. He increased funding for the University of California. One of the most interesting interviews I had for this book was actually with Jerry Brown, who was the son of Pat Brown, the guy that Reagan beat for governor in 1966, and then Jerry Brown succeeded Reagan as governor in the 1970s. And I asked Jerry Brown, what did you think of Reagan's record as governor? And his reply surprised me, because what he said was, I think Reagan was a pretty good governor, which is not what you would expect from a liberal Democrat talking about a conservative Republican. But I think that's an indication of the extent to which Reagan was able to move to the center as governor. And then he did the exact same thing as president, where he signed legislation that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He saved Social Security. He cut deals with Democrats all the time. He actually raised taxes more often than he cut them. So his actual record in office was of a supreme pragmatist. And somebody wanted to the point that George was just making. Reagan often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want today and come back for more tomorrow rather than go over the cliff with my flags flying. And I feel like today there's a lot of members of Reagan's party and some Democrats as well who'd rather go over the cliff with their flags flying.
I think that was brilliant, except for the some Democrats. I think you look at both parties, and there are far too many ideologues who are happy going over the cliff if they think it advances their political philosophy.
So that leads into this question. It's for you, George.
I had to give Max a little hard time here.
So you're governor of New York, Reagan, governor of California, two pretty rare species of Republicans, governing deep blue states. How did you manage to work across the aisle? You had Shelley Silver as the speaker. You created compromise in Albany. How did you do it in Albany? How did Reagan do it in Sacramento? Go ahead.
I could take a month trying to answer that question, but let me try to be brief. I would outline the program, and the normal answer from particularly the Assembly would be, this is nuts. You're a Republican, you're a conservative, this makes no sense. So what I try to do, and it worked a lot, was say, well, this is the goal I'm trying to achieve. I want to have tougher criminal penalties. Oh, no, it's terrible. Well, what I want to do is reduce the level of violent crime in this state. And I believe this is the best way to do it. We're the most dangerous state in America. And I want to try this to make us safer. And those who had opposed everything, I'd say, how do you propose making us safer? And don't you agree with the goal? The state is too dangerous, we should make it safer. And they'd say, well, yeah, we agree with the goal. And then I go, well, how do you think we should get there? And more often than not, they take a look at my proposed solution and say, okay, we'll give you a chance. And if it hadn't worked, you get thrown out. But in the vast majority of the cases, it worked. So what I tried to do was look at the solution, look at the goal, as opposed to the policy that would achieve that goal, and then have a dialogue as to how best to achieve that goal. And it usually worked, and when it didn't, sometimes you had to bludgeon the opposition into submission. I remember some of our budget battles where you're supposed to have the state budget adopted by April 1st, and it'd be the middle of August, and we'd have no budget, and everybody'd be screaming and yelling. But I just didn't want to have a budget for the sake of having a budget. I wanted to have something that I believed would make the state better. And there you had to just bludgeon the opposition into submission. And the governor has a lot of power. And ultimately, sometimes I needed to use that power to achieve those goals.
Thank you. Max, I want you to talk about the power of mass media exposure for a president. Reagan, his B-movie, television actor career, Trump, reality TV star, and also Reagan's really pivotal time as host of the very popular General Electric Theater show on CBS, and his years as a GE pitchman. Now, I know he visited Schenectady a few times, had to go to the plants around the country as part of his contract. He had to confront very angry union, blue-collar workers. How did he do that?
What I argue in the book is that Reagan's years working for GE were truly pivotal to his development of both his ideology and his political skills. And of course, there are only two men who have become U.S. presidents after hosting nationally televised shows. And Ronald Reagan was the first one on General Electric Theater. He was beamed in across the country on CBS on Sunday evenings in the 1950s, so everybody in the country felt like they knew this guy because he was in their living room every day. So it was tremendous exposure at the very dawn of the television age. But he was doing more than just reading scripts on General Electric Theater. He was going around the country speaking on behalf of GE, including at their Schenectady plant or a lot of other plants around the country. And this was basically where he was learning the skills of a retail politician because he was figuring out, how do you connect with blue-collar workers? How do you connect with engineers? How do you connect with managers? He was able to speak to a wide variety of people, and this was when he was developing his method of giving speeches. And of course, later on, as president, he became renowned as somebody who was very good at reading a script. He could read a teleprompter, and a lot of people said, he's just an actor, so he's used to reading stuff that other people put in front of him. There's some truth to that. But in the 1950s and early 60s, he didn't have anybody writing these speeches for him. He wrote them himself, and he developed this pattern of doing it where he would take these index cards, and he was an inveterate reader. I mean, inveterate, and I would say somewhat indiscriminate reader. He would take these long cross-country train journeys because in those days he was afraid to fly, and he had a lot of time to read on the train, and so he was a charter subscriber to National Review. He read Human Events. He read Reader's Digest. He read a lot of things, and when he read stuff, it wasn't always accurate, but he would write down what he read, and he would have this system of note cards with facts and arguments and anecdotes and statistics. Again, not always 100% accurate because he didn't tend to fact check what he was saying, but things that resonated with him. And then when he would give a speech, he would shuffle his cards, and so he would never give the same speech twice. And then as he was giving the speech, he would be looking out at the audience with a trained actor's eye, and he would be judging the reaction to what he was saying, and he would see that some cards resonated and some cards didn't. And so the ones that didn't resonate, those would go in the trash can. The ones that resonated, they stayed in the pile. And so people were shocked and surprised in the fall of 1964 when Ronald Reagan made his political debut, giving this half-hour televised address, which became known as the Time for Choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater. It was compared to, some people said it was the most electrifying political debut since William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. But what people didn't realize was what they were looking at in 1964 was not something he had written the night before. It was a product of basically 10 years of going out there on behalf of GE and speaking at these plants and Kiwanis clubs and Oaks clubs or whatever, and honing this address to a very finely developed speech with all these zingers and one-liners that he had been testing with audiences for years. And that's why he was able to run and succeed and win a race for governor of California, the most populous state in the country, the very first time he ran for office, because basically working for GE had been the school of politics for him during the preceding decade.
That's exactly how I prepare my speeches.
I saw your cards tonight.
You saw my speeches, too.
This is for you, George. You came out of retirement, put your unblemished record of never having lost an election in this long-shot bid against a very crowded Republican presidential field in 2016. Why? Did you fear Donald Trump was going to win? Did you predict Trump's unexpected victory? And can you share any stories, this is a family audience here, of your encounters or confrontations with Donald J. Trump?
You know, and I never thought that Donald Trump would be the nominee, let alone elected. I was really shocked. But I did think the country needed a new direction, and that the best opportunity to change the direction would be by electing a Republican. And I looked at the other people in the field, and I was unimpressed. They looked at me, and they were unimpressed. So that's the other side of the coin. But I just thought, you know, I had successfully, I think, run a huge state as a conservative Republican in a Democratic state, and that those skills would allow me to have been able to run the country. But, you know, it was interesting because it started off really great, and then the first debate is Fox News. And there are so many candidates out there, they decide to have an earlier debate and then the main debate. And it's like, I refer to it as being relegated to the kiddies table at dinner. And they did it just based on your polling number at the time. And so I was relegated to the kiddies table. So as soon as that happened, I knew that the odds of having any chance were pretty slim.
Any Trump stories?
Oh, yes. No, I mean, he's obviously a prominent New Yorker when I was governor, and we had a few run-ins, I think it's fair to say. When the Catskills were a dying historic resort community, and I thought putting a casino in the Catskills would help revive it because you had them in Connecticut, you had them in Atlantic City. and we had worked out a deal with one of the Native American groups to do it, and all of a sudden there's these millions in ads being run saying somehow I'm a crook or this is corrupt or anything, and I'm going, what is this about? And it never dawned on me that Donald Trump owned these Atlantic City casinos, and he didn't want any competition. So turns out the lobbying commission fined him an enormous amount because they didn't disclose who was actually running the ad. So that was one of my run-ins.
Do you think he ever paid it?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
So this is for both of you. Now, both of you published very strong opinion pieces in print on Trump being unfit to be president for a second term. How did he come to win the vote of a majority of American voters, and where is your criticism now, this great silencing that is taking place on college campuses, on corporations and politicians? He's put the intimidation on so many people. Would you write those same pieces now, and what is your take? Because we're going to get into the last chapter of your book is really Trump country, and you have some very strong words in there. But would you write the same piece now?
Yeah, I would not only write the same piece now, I would say I was probably underestimating the danger, because I think he's actually turned out to be even worse in many respects than I anticipated. I mean, in terms of how he won, damned if I know. I mean, I think it basically comes down to inflation, which has been a killer of political popularity throughout the Western world, not only in the United States, and the fact that we had a 20% rise in the price level between 2020 and 2024, I think fatally undermined the Democratic Party. Of course, you had all the problems with Biden looking old and out of it, and then, of course, Kamala Harris coming in at the last minute, not really having a lot of time, and Trump was able to paint her as, as a quote-unquote woke extremist pretty effectively, and she didn't have a good counter to that, so he won. But now, I mean, I think there is criticism, but I think there is also a lot of intimidation, and you see the way that the administration is going after law firms, the way they're trying to deport a student activist at Columbia University. They're sending a signal that they will retaliate for people who speak out against them, and I think that has an impact. I think with a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill, I think they're worried, and they're not just worried that they're going to lose their jobs if they oppose Trump, which is a real concern. I think they're worried about their physical safety and the physical safety of their families if they oppose Trump. So I think there is physical intimidation. I mean, remember, he pardoned the January 6th defendants, so there are all these militias running around free from prison. So I think it's a very dangerous climate. I think this is a real threat to our democracy.
I think Max is right about inflation being an important part of the election last year, but I think it was far more than that. I think it was immigration was a disaster with the open border and fentanyl. I think, yes, inflation, but also there was this whole belief, and I think the overriding picture is that a significant percentage, perhaps the majority of Americans, think that the country has been run by a group of arrogant elites in Washington and government and the media and the universities and academia in Hollywood who have virtually no respect for them. And yes, you're here, maybe you go to work or something, but we know what's best because we're smarter, better educated, and more powerful than you are. And I think that really was the overarching reason why Trump was able to put together this very broad coalition. And I think another part of it, of course, was that Biden and Harris Biden was perceived as not fit to serve 4 more years given his status last summer, and that Harris was not up to the task of coming out of nowhere and mounting a serious campaign where people would respect her. So I think that rejection of the arrogant elitism of the people who control the levers of power in America was the overriding issue in my mind, and it crossed racial lines, ethnic lines, age lines, economic lines, and coupled with inflation and immigration and others, I think led to his victory.
Of course, I mean, I think you're right, but of course the ultimate irony is that the great populist, anti-elitist Donald Trump has placed the world's richest man unelected to any office and basically in charge of running the government. So I don't, kind of an irony that the ultimate elite is now in control.
So we started a little late, so we'll go a little past our usual hour, so we'll go a little past 8:30. But this will be my last question. And then if you have a question, raise your hand. Jen will bring a mic around. But this is for Max, since you were born in the Soviet Union, Council of Foreign Relations, have studied Putin. What is it with Trump and Putin, in your estimation? Is there some leverage there? Does Trump just want to be an autocrat and he's studying him up closely? What's your best analysis of their relationship?
I've given up trying to analyze the Trump-Putin relationship. It's clear that Trump deeply admires Putin, but what the nature of their bond is, very hard to say. It could just be that Trump looks up to Putin as kind of the strong man that he would like to be. You can infer other reasons, none of which have been proven, but I think the reality is he has been reorienting U.S. policy in a fairly pro-Russia direction to a shocking degree. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the United States voted with North Korea, Belarus, and Iran at the United Nations against the resolution censuring Russia for its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. I mean, just unbelievable. Couldn't imagine any other president voting against a resolution like that. And last week, Trump paused aid to Ukraine. Today, I guess they're restarting it. Very hard to figure out all the zigs and zags, but clearly Trump is somebody who looks up to Putin and at the same time has nothing but contempt for America's democratic allies. I mean, he constantly trashes Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, calling him, quote unquote, Governor Trudeau at the same time. And he says that, President Zelensky of Ukraine, who I think is one of the great leaders in the world today, Trump calls him a quote-unquote dictator, blames him for starting the war, but won't call Putin a dictator. So clearly, this is not normal. But I can't explain the nature of the attraction.
If you can't, Max, I don't know. Do you want to weigh in on that, George, before we go to the audience?
I can't either, but I'll tell you, I just think it's really reprehensible that we have not just stood with Ukraine and rejected the fact that you have this alliance of evil states, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, and the Islamists, radical Islamists from Chechnya fighting against a Western country that is a democracy. Is it a perfect democracy? No, but then none of them are. So I just find that hard to believe. I think part of it is that Trump sees everything through himself. He said he was going to end the war. And so he has to end the war. And how he does it, I don't think is particularly high on his list, to have a just or a fair result that protects Ukraine. I think it's more just keeping his promise. And he saw, until today, Ukraine and Zelensky as the biggest impediment to that because they were resisting a ceasefire and saying they want to take back all their land, which is totally understandable, but probably not realistic. And when they agreed today, Ukraine, to a ceasefire, he then, as Max said, has agreed to resume military aid and surveillance assistance. But to me, this is a black and white situation. Russia is the invader. Russia is wrong. Putin is evil. And we should stand with Ukraine. And I just hope today is the beginning
Let's cheer
of
for
changing
that. Thank you. Raise your hand if you have a question, and the mic from Jen will come around. Who's got a question? We'll start. One here, one there, wherever you want to. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. Ronald Reagan, as you've described, was a master in being able to move to the middle and solve the problems. And the story about Tip O'Neill is one of the famous ones in that regard. Yet, historians, I believe, or experts in their field, have identified Reagan as maybe the genesis of the period when the polarization really started in our country, and kind of give him some of the blame, if you will, in that regard. Could you speak to that? Do you agree with that, or is that off base?
I mean, I wouldn't say that Reagan was the origins of our polarization. I mean, you can certainly look at least to the 1960s when, as I recall, we were pretty polarized back then. In some ways, Reagan was actually able to unite and bring the nation together. I mean, remember, in 1984, he won 49 out of 50 states, an achievement that today seems like science fiction, but he actually managed to pull it off. I do think that there are, if you want to look at the roots of our present crisis, I think there are some origins in the 1980s. One of the things you can look at is income disparity in America, which if you look at the trend lines, it goes like this, beginning in the early 1980s. The rich getting much richer, the poor getting poorer, the middle class kind of stagnating. That's a trend that dates back to the early 1980s. And a lot of that, to be fair, is not Reagan's doing, because you're talking about globalization, automation, the computer age. A lot of things are going on outside of political control, but there is no question that his tax policies benefited the wealthiest citizens and increased income disparity. The fact that he was anti-union, the fact that he took a very lax attitude towards antitrust enforcement, all these things, I think, increased income disparity. And so now we've reached a point where income disparity in America is similar to that of many Latin American countries, and I think it's been a very destabilizing factor. It's led to populism on the left, like the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's also led to populism on the right, like the MAGA movement, and Trump basically takes advantage of those sentiments, I think, even ironically, while his own policies will only exacerbate income inequality.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Yeah, I don't think Reagan did not, in my view, in any way go out of his way or have policies that were aimed at polarizing the country. As Max just said, you know, he united the country and created a spirit of optimism that didn't exist when he took office. And to me, and Max might dispute it, but his greatest accomplishment was standing up to the Soviet Union. I'm old enough to remember in school hiding under my desk, so then when the nuclear bombs went off, we would survive by hiding under our desk in a room with all glass windows on the whole side. But he really united the country in saying Russia's an evil empire, and we have got to stand up to them. And I don't think that was polarizing at all. I would think it was effective. It laid the foundation for the complete collapse of the Soviet Union a few years later. So I'd give him enormous credit for uniting us to accomplish that, and not in creating the basis for division.
Thank you. Another question, Jim?
I think you kind of were just talking about it. What were the lessons that we could learn from Reagan dealing with the Soviet Union, and how could they be applied today?
Well, it's hard to apply the lessons today because it was a very different time, and Reagan was very confrontational with the Soviet Union during his first term, talking about the evil empire, building up the defense budget, launching the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars, and people often draw kind of a straight line from those hard-term, tough first-term policies towards the eventual collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. And I argue in the book that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because Reagan's first-term policies didn't really pay any big dividends until 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. And Reagan had wanted to actually meet with the leader of the Soviet Union in his first term, but as he said, they kept dying on me. And finally, in Gorbachev, he had a younger, more reform-minded leader, and Gorbachev was really a black swan, somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system while losing faith in it and truly wanted to reform the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of skepticism of Gorbachev, but when Reagan met Gorbachev in Geneva in November of 1985, the two men saw eye to eye and realized that although here you had the world's #1 capitalist and the #1 communist, They actually shared a common horror of nuclear war, a desire to bring peace, and so they were able to work together peacefully to wind down the Cold War, and that was ultimately, I think, why Reagan's second-term foreign policy was so successful. But you can't really translate that policy to the current situation because Vladimir Putin is no Mikhail Gorbachev. He is not a liberal reformer. He is an evil despot who is actually taking Russia back to the dark days of Stalin, and he has launched this horrific, evil war of aggression against Ukraine, even beyond anything that was seen in the last years of the Soviet Union. So I don't think in Vladimir Putin, we don't have a partner for peace in the way that Reagan had with Gorbachev. And so I think, in dealing with Putin, I think Reagan's first-term policies are the ones that are more appropriate, even though Trump now seems to think that Putin is devoted to peace and he can be buddies with him and reach a deal with him. I think that is a very dangerous hope.
I don't want to disagree with Max, who's an expert on this stuff, but I think that his first-term policies were absolutely critical. He was almost constantly attacking the Soviet Union as a failed enterprise. And I think, I don't know, obviously I wasn't there, but if I'm in the leadership of the Soviet Union and you're looking around and you're seeing, there's truth to what he's saying. We can't compete with America economically, we can't compete with them militarily, and that would be part of the reason why a reformer like Gorbachev would have had to have a chance to rise through the ranks as opposed to another hardliner. You have to look internally, and in today's climate, I think it would be magnificent if we had a president who did the same thing to Russia, who pointed out how Russia is failing, not just because of its Ukraine policy, but because its economy is cratering, its demographics are collapsing. It has a shorter life expectancy than India. And standing up and pointing out the fact that Putin has Stalinized the system and it's failing. And I think that's the best way to have some hope that at some point Russia sees the light and understands that it not only can't compete with the United States and the West because of Putin's failed policies, but it's also damaging the Russian people enormously.
Yes, I had a question. So going back to Reagan's first run in 1980, what was the old guard Republican Party's reaction to that at the time? I know if you go back to the late 40s, early 50s, you had kind of the Robert Taft kind of wing of the Republican Party. It seems like there was more of an openness with that kind of wing to like tariffs and non-interventionism. And I was wondering, did that wing of the party still exist in the 80s? Did they have any like reaction, negative or positive about Reagan? And did Reagan in any way like shift the whatever was the ideological kind of point of the Republican Party at that point?
I would say that the isolationist, high tariff wing of the Republican Party, which you correctly associate with Robert Taft, was pretty much vanquished in 1952. I mean, that was why Dwight D. Eisenhower decided to run for the Republican nomination, because he thought it'd be so dangerous to have Taft become president. He wanted to block him, and basically, I don't think that there was a substantial isolationist or protectionist constituency in the Republican Party from 1952 on until, let's say, 2016. I guess some of those sentiments were always dormant, but they were not given voice by Republican leaders. And Reagan certainly would have been completely opposed to any idea of isolationism. He was very ardently pro-NATO. He believed deeply in the U.S.-Europe alliance. He believed in standing up to Russian aggression. He also was completely opposed to high tariffs, because remember, Reagan was a member of the greatest generation. He was somebody who was born in 1911. He was a military officer during World War II, albeit on a Hollywood backlot, but he saw what happened. And like all the I think most of the members of his generation, he saw how the America First policies of the 1930s and the Smoot-Hawley tariff of the 1930s, those led America to economic and geopolitical disaster. And so after World War II, the greatest generation understood that America could not afford to shelter behind its two oceans, could not afford to pursue tariff barriers, that we had to lead the world, we had to try to preserve peace and stability in Europe and Asia, and we could lead the way towards a freer and more prosperous world. And even though Reagan changed political affiliation, going again from being a liberal New Deal Democrat to being a very conservative Republican, his foreign policy views did not really change that much, and his economic views on, at least on international economics, did not change that much. So I think he would be shocked and aghast at where his old party has wound up today.
I think we have time for 2 more quick questions, and then the signing will follow immediately with our 2 authors.
Good evening. I'm drawing parallels between Governors Pataki, your kind of milestone in your political career with winning the governorship after Governor Mario Cuomo, and Ronald Reagan's ascension to the governorship after defeating Pat Brown. 2 incumbent candidates. People were kind of looking for change. Governor, do you have any perhaps commentary on if you looked to Ronald Reagan's governorship, or if you have parallels to your ascension in your career and his ascension in his career?
I didn't follow Ronald Reagan's career as governor that thoroughly, but I think we both had to deal with a majority of the other party, at least in one house of the legislature. As a consequence, to get things done, you had to work across party lines and compromise. And I think he had to, and I had to. But winning the elections are just completely different. I think the one thing we probably had in common is that we both made it plain from the beginning what we stood for and what we wanted to do. I ran on basically 3 things. Taxes were too high, and I was going to cut taxes. Crime was too high, and I was going to get tough on criminals. And New York State had too many people dependent on social services and welfare, and we were going to reform that. And the vast majority of New Yorkers agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why when I did get elected, I had the chance to implement those policies despite the partisan makeup of the legislature. So I think Ronald Reagan always made it pretty clear what he wanted to do. And so people had a choice as opposed to voting by party. And certainly that's what I tried to do.
Thank you. And last question here.
I'm honored to ask the last question. So one thing, I'm a teacher, and one thing that's very difficult is trying to show any clips of things happening, whether it be on the state level or the national level, to my students. You show them the State of the Union, and it's very difficult to talk about anything like bipartisanship, working together, accomplishing things. But when I look back to when I was in middle school and you were governor, things were calm. Things seemed to just work the way you may not have seen it that way, but
seemed to be.
Yeah. Well. Thank you for making it seem that way. but in reality, if you were president automatically tomorrow, what could you do to make it so that people weren't at each other so much that not only are things not getting along, but everybody is on edge, even if they're not directly involved?
First thing is you don't make things personal. It's not about this is an evil person and I'm a good person, except in the case of Putin. There it's pretty clear. It's this is what I want to do, and can you help me, or do you have a different idea? But I just want to tell you one story about that calmness. I remember, and I'm sure Jack remembers this, one time I was giving the State of the State in early January. It was freezing cold, and I set the record because I had over 35,000 protesters surrounding the Capitol, storming around with signs, banging on the doors, and you could hear them inside the Capitol. It was the largest demonstration in Albany ever, and it happened in January, and it was a whole group of different groups, all of whom hated me at the time, but you don't take it personally. I'm just going to tell you one story about it. So finally, it's like 5 o'clock at night, I'm done, and I get a call. And it's from the head of one of the unions that had brought up 20,000 people. And I had talked to him constantly while we were battling. And he goes, Governor, I have a real problem. And I go, what's that? He goes, I have, thousands of people who've come up from New York. It's freezing cold. We can't find our buses. They're about to kill me. Can you send the state police out to please find the buses before I get lynched? So I laugh and I go, of course. And by the way, I also opened the concourse and the dining room and the big auditorium in the state education building so they wouldn't be outside freezing. And we found the buses. But I think that's some of the way you do it. Instead of demonizing those who happen to disagree with you, they're people. They have their ideas. They have their constituents that they have to be responsible to. And you are the same. And ultimately, treat them with respect and try to find common ground. And if you can't, just go win. That's all. That's basically it.
We'll give Max the last word. President Max Boot, yeah, thank you, Governor Pataki. You're suddenly president. What are you going to do to sort of make America great again, I guess? He stole that from Reagan, by the way. I saw in your book.
To quote Bill Buckley, I would ask for a recount if I were suddenly president. No, I think what George said is right. I think if you look at Ronald Reagan's success, he could be, very hard-edged and ideological on the campaign trail, but he never engaged in name-calling. He never went after opponents personally because he understood that he had to work with them. And there's this kind of mythology about Reagan and Tip O'Neill. They were not really bosom buddies. They were not best friends. I mean, Tip O'Neill actually thought that Reagan was the worst president he ever served with and didn't care about poor people. And Reagan was often pretty teed off at what Tip would say about him. But they were also practical politicians who understood how to count votes and how to get things done. And they weren't in Washington to make grand, futile gestures. They were in Washington to pass legislation and get things done. And so it wasn't that they were, again, best friends. It was that they were practical leaders who understood how to put their differences aside in the greater good. And of course, Reagan realized that if he was out there calling Tip O'Neill a traitor and a commie and saying all these horrible things about him, it would be pretty hard to be in the same room with Tip the next day and compromise. He never did that. He would have never occurred to him to do that anyway because he was the soul of gentility. He was a consummate gentleman. He would never engage in invective or name calling. But, the way he behaved was really a product of his personality, which was that he was a genuinely nice, considerate, thoughtful person. And that went a long way in dealing with his political opponents. He was able to win them over. I remember talking to another prominent Democrat, Willie Brown, longtime Speaker of the California Assembly, Mayor of San Francisco, ardent Democrat, but he was telling me about how he was friends with Ronald Reagan. And when, Reagan was governor and he would have the leaders of the legislature over, he and Willie Brown would sneak off downstairs and watch the toy trains in the Reagan's basement. So this was what Reagan was doing to get his legislation passed. He wasn't out there calling Willie Brown a so-and-so and all sorts of names. He was out there watching playing on the toy trains with them and building up a relationship that paid off in legislation.
So what a fantastic evening. It's often said that Albany only has one major league sport, and that's politics. I think we had two Hall of Famers here tonight, two of the greatest political minds and brilliant, wonderful people that we've had on this stage. It was a great honor. This book is an instant classic of biography, presidential history. Get them before they get sold out. A big, warm round of applause for Max Boot, Governor, three-term Governor, George Pataki. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.